Greetings. This is lecture 4 in the soil health module, and today we're going to talk about the principles of soil biology. I'm Kate Scow. I'm a professor of soil science and microbial ecology in the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources at University of California, Davis. So what we're going to cover today is the soil biology. I'm going to start by looking at the soil food web, bigger picture look at what's going on below ground, talk a little bit about diversity and functions, and then briefly go through the major groups of organisms that are living in soil, and then talk a little bit about lifestyles of organisms. So soil biology provides multiple services in agriculture and in any kind of terrestrial ecosystem, and they're extremely important for processing waste, breaking down organic material back into their mineral components. They can break down pesticides and remove nutrients. They support animals and plants, including humans as animals. They're in our digestive tracts and are really responsible helping plants and animals process their nutrients. They can sequester carbon and fix nitrogen, build soil organic matter. And so we'll be talking a little bit about this. A lot of these services that microorganisms provide are taken for granted. We don't ever think about it. And in addition, so much of the potential for microorganisms to contribute to agriculture is not utilized as a function of choices we make for how we manage agricultural systems. So there's way more they could be doing. And it speaks to why it's really important for us to have a better understanding of all these things that microorganisms can do, and thinking for how we can partner with them to improve how we manage agriculture. So often we think about how much biodiversity there is above ground. There's a lot of interest in like animal diversity and plant biodiversity, but there's way more biodiversity below ground than above ground, something that isn't always appreciated. And so we're going to talk a little bit about these organisms. So here's a picture of a soil food web showing the relationship between primary productivity, which in this case, in terrestrial systems, is carried out by plants who have half of their biomass or their organism above ground, where they can have access to light, and they fix CO2 into these reduced carbon forms that then enter into the soil when the plant dies, but also through the root exudates of the plants. And then this detritus is then this source of energy and nutrients for this below ground food web. And once it goes in, you have some action already by microorganisms, but you also have this really other important function carried out by fauna, micro and macrofauna, that break down these big chunks of residue into smaller pieces that then can be broken down much more rapidly by bacteria and fungi. So I call them sort of the front line. And then they are in turn grazed upon or preyed upon by also fauna, and who then also turn over the nutrients that are inside the microorganisms that have been feeding on the plant material. And the other thing that we don't want to forget to mention is the importance of feces, and particularly we think of this with earthworms, where some of that residue that is consumed by worms is then released in the form of another kind of organic matter with feces that is often inoculated with microorganisms in the process. So soil is the most diverse ecosystem on Earth. And this is based on a lot of new work that's been happening with sequencing the DNA of this tremendous, tremendous diversity. And we know from this work that we don't even begin to know about all of the different kinds of organisms that live in soil. But we're working on it. This picture here shows you a handful of soil and some numbers of some of these different kinds of taxa that make up soil. So if we focus on the microorganisms, we have huge numbers of bacteria in like a handful of soil. I mean, it could easily be billions and billions, and huge diversity. Like it could be 10,000 species in that. With fungi, we think in length more with fungi, so kilometers of fungal filament, particularly in systems where fungi aren't shut out, allowed to establish more, and also a huge number of species. And then also a lot of different kinds of species of protozoa and nematodes and insects and worms. And so just, I mean, the message here is just huge numbers. These are small organisms, and a huge amount of diversity that we are still learning about. So, and there's also lots of functions, as we talked about in that first picture where I showed the farm of all these different services that microorganisms provide. So if we look at what these services are, this is a really nice graph that then maps those services back to the particular functional groups of organisms. So like we're really interested in nutrient cycling. It's the service that we might be interested in. The processes that lead to nutrient cycling or decomposition or transformation of elements, symbiosis, and then the functional groups. So the particular microorganisms that are involved. So this is categorizing them by the functions they carry out, not by like their species name, which is sometimes less useful to know who they are than what they do. And so these functions are microsymbionts, decomposers, transformers, and same with these other services like soil erosion and sequestering carbon and movement of water through soil is very much governed by soil structure. Incredibly important process is the making of soil structure, which we humans tend to try to break down a lot in how we farm. And then these functional groups that are the engineers in the soil that carry that out. And then biological control as well. But the same ideas. We can look at organisms by their sort of species name, by what we call taxa, but also it's extremely interesting and perhaps more useful to think of them as functional groups. And we have a lot of diversity, as I said, in soil, and sometimes different species or taxa that carry out the same function. And so people talk a lot about redundancy. Is there a tremendous amount of functional redundancy in soil, and why could that be good? And this is an example of nitrogen fixation, showing that there's a variety of different ways that nitrogen can be fixed, including in these famous symbiotic relationships like between rhizobia and legumes. There can be weaker associations between plants and organisms with associative nitrogen fixers like azospirillum, and then there's also free-living nitrogen fixers, those brave souls in the soil that are carrying out nitrogen fixation without having a plant directly provide them with the carbon and energy that they need to do it. So look at, there's a variety of different ways nitrogen is fixed. They have different kinds of energy sources and different kinds of lifestyles that lead to carrying out this nitrogen fixation. And we also have these really different rates of nitrogen fixation as a function of the kinds of ways that this nitrogen is being fixed. But this is just an example of showing you this functional redundancy in this function of nitrogen fixation. There's a lot of different kinds of organisms that can carry it out. So let's start to talk about particular groups of organisms and start with the bacteria. Very major group of organisms in the soil have enormous metabolic diversity. And we'll talk at the end of this lecture about lifestyles or how organisms are making livings. But they can use all different kinds of things for energy, for obtaining energy. They can live with or without the presence of oxygen. Some of them can like fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere. They grow really rapidly. They evolve really rapidly. Not all of them, but a lot of them can like adapt really quickly to conditions. Some of them are quite good at surviving really poor conditions. They can make spores, so they can just become dormant. And a rule of thumb is they're on the order of a micron in diameter, and they have unique cell wall components. For example, peptidoglycan. So why am I telling you that? It doesn't seem that interesting. It's like some trivia, but actually, what cells are made of has a huge impact on carbon sequestration, on building soil organic matter in soil, because soil organic matter is made from dead microbes. So the cell wall component is actually an interesting attribute that we might want to think in the future about managing. Actinomycetes are filamentous bacteria, gram positive, but they are a kind of bacterium. They have conidia, asexual spores that help them survive and disseminate. They're the organisms that produce antibiotics, and that they use to compete below ground. That earthy smell of soil when it rains, geosmin, is produced by an actinomycete, and they're really important for decomposing complex organic matter. Their filamentous lifestyle may help in this. Another really important group of organisms that we didn't even know existed a few decades ago are archaea. We used to think they were within the bacteria, and these are organisms that we still call them extremophiles, but they're not all extremophiles. They don't all only live under extreme conditions. They're molecularly different. Their DNA is quite different from the DNA of bacteria, and they have different kinds of cell wall components, different membranes, but they're on the same size, in the same size range as bacteria. And so are they important in soil? Well, actually, methanogens, organisms that produce methane, are all archaea. So they're really important in like rice systems where we might be concerned about making methane, and also animal systems where with ruminants. But also we've learned that nitrifiers who include archaea. We used to think only bacteria did this, but these are organisms that carry out this extremely important process in agriculture, converting ammonium to nitrite to nitrate. And the fact that archaea are doing it and not just bacteria is like a big, astonishing sort of discovery, because we don't really know what makes archaea tick and what they need. So we've got a lot we need to learn about them. But they're here. They're in California soils. I mean, archaea may only make up 5% of the population of bacteria and archaea in the soil. Only maybe 5% might be them, 5 to 10, but they're there, and we don't quite know what they're doing. Okay, fungi are another really important group, estimated 1.5 million species. Again, only a small fraction have been described. They're bigger than bacteria. Their cell diameter is on the order of 2 to 30 microns. And we get into this issue of what's an individual of a fungus, because you can have essentially one fungus that's similar based on looking at the DNA, but that can occupy a huge body of land, like 1,500 acres. So making us adjust the largest organism on the planet isn't the blue whale, but it's these fungi in forests. Most fungi are filamentous. An exception is yeasts. They have asexual and sexual spores. Their cell walls are made of like chitin and cellulose that may also contain some complex other kinds of organic compounds like melanin and tannin, again, very important for making soil organic matter. They're more competitive than some, but not all bacteria at lower pHs, but tend to dominate more in acidic conditions, and also really good at breaking down complex organic matter. Now, a cool thing about fungi is that they can live at really, really low water contents because all microorganisms need to be in water films to be physiologically active. So you can imagine when soil gets very dry, conditions get really tight because the water is just coating particle surfaces, and organisms have to like make a living inside that, and they increasingly run out of space. But fungi can span the air filled gaps to go over to like across the way to maybe a little pocket of moisture with nutrients in it, and translocate that those nutrients and that water back to where they're growing in the original place. So really, really good at low moisture conditions. Okay, and what are the functions of organisms, going back to this issue of who they are versus what they do? And that's a big challenge in soil microbiology, is linking who are the actors to what are the functions. So we've got over here photosynthesizing organisms that aren't going to be so important where plants can live. It's extremely important in arid ecosystems where the primary producers might be these like scums of desert crust or cyanobacteria that fix very small amounts of carbon, but they're the main sources. But often, photosynthesizers aren't as important in soil. Decomposers, who are carrying out all these different functions of retaining nutrients but breaking down nutrients out of the organic forms, building soil aggregates, making extracellular polymers that help glue together aggregates, being suppressors of diseases by being competitive with organisms that might come in and try to infect a plant, breaking down pesticides, and also mutualists. So these can be in very tight relationships with plants, or it can be in these looser relationships with plants that we'll talk about when we talk about the rhizosphere briefly. Okay, so another major group of organisms are protozoa. So they're single cell cellular, but on the order of 5 to 500 microns, and they feed on bacteria and fungi and protozoa as well, on each other, but also sometimes soluble organic nutrients. And they're really important in releasing some of the nitrogen that isn't it's beyond what bacteria need. So in preying on bacteria, protozoa are kind of liberating some of the nitrogen that was in the bacteria that can now be used by plants. Protozoa are phylogenetically very diverse. You can see here flagellates, amoeba, and ciliates. 30,000 species estimated. A lot of them are phagotrophs. That means they engulf their prey, and they're also really good at surviving the harsh conditions of soil. Some of them make cysts. And, that's kind of the story of soil. Soil sometimes gets kind of harsh. And so you have to be able to, if you're going to make it there, you have to have strategies to be able to endure those hard times. And then we have micro and macrofauna. And this is a great picture from Dindal that shows like all these just lovely creatures that live in soil, and in a compost heap, you're going to see it, even more kind of in your face, greater numbers, greater density. Just like we started out with the picture of the food web, here are some of the actual actors: springtails and mites and beetles, and then the higher organisms, a lot of insects and pseudoscorpions, ants that are then consuming this first tier of predators, and just a huge variety of organisms. And of course, we have tardigrades, who are the cutest, most charismatic, I think, these days, soil fauna who've been shot into space and seem to be able to survive anything. Check them out if you haven't heard about them. Okay, soil fauna are really important for a number of functions, and seems like I have a bunch of ones here, but really important for, as I said, this front line of shredding plant residues and making feces that then open up opportunities for other organisms, like particularly the microorganisms, then to really get to work and completely break down those residues back down into their essential elements that are making them up. And this picture shows you the mass remaining of some grass that's without any organisms altogether, doesn't degrade at all. But then with microorganisms alone, the rate of breakdown is much slower than in the presence of there being some fauna. They also are important for mixing the soil and increasing aeration, and we'll look at a picture of earthworms in a second on that. They inoculate the plant residue, through the feces, or through their own feeding with microorganisms, and of course, they're really important for controlling microbial populations through their predation. And here is some pictures of showing what brilliant ecosystem engineers earthworms are. Here's a, a drawing showing these burrows that particular kinds of earthworms can make and what they do. And then here's some actual photographs of it in like a clay soil. And then here's a blow up so you can see it better at the scale of a worm. And they're bringing down organic matter into these burrows, so doing kind of a tillage or a bioturbation, but they also create preferential flow paths that water will move down as well, but very, very have important impacts on ecosystems. Now, the rhizosphere is a talk a little bit about this microenvironment in soil. Is the area that's immediately adjacent to the plant root, and which is a little bit different from what we call the bulk soil. So we define the rhizosphere as this zone under the influence of plant roots, and if we're studying it, people have this sort of methodology, which is you shake the soil for a certain set of time at a certain sort of intensity, and what clings to the soils after that is the rhizosphere soil. And in contrast, we call bulk soil the soil that's out of the sphere of the rhizosphere. And you can imagine grassland, you'd be really hard pressed to find bulk soil, but like think about in a desert region where you have creosote bushes and then big spans of no vegetation at all. And there the rhizosphere would be very segregated, and most would be bulk soil. So rhizosphere is characterized by having lots of carbon being produced there. 30 to 60% of the carbon that the plant fixes is exuded as exudates or sloughed off cells or mucilage. So there's much more carbon down there. pH might be a little bit lower than the bulk soil. You have ions that are either higher or lower concentrations, depending on what the plant does with them once they move towards the plant root when it's transpiring. You can have more compaction right around there. You have distinctly different microbial communities in the rhizosphere than the bulk soil. A lot of them, these like plant growth promoting organisms that are going to really help the plant do it. Because why is the plant putting 30 to 60% of its photosynthate? That means like the carbon that is fixing from the atmosphere. Why is it just leaking it out the roots? And it's because they're getting a lot back from it. There's a lot of relationships with microbes that are going to be very beneficial to the plant. So symbiosis is a relationship between microorganisms and plants. Symbiosis is a relationship between two organisms, and extremely important in terrestrial ecosystems. Almost all plants have a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi. This picture shows you the two main kinds. There's ectos, which are primarily in woody plants, and then endomycorrhizae, which is in pretty much all other kinds of plants. You're hard pressed to find plants that do not have mycorrhizal fungi. And what do they do? The benefits of the plant is that it essentially increases the volume of the soil that the plant can exploit with its roots by having these extensions of these mycorrhizal fungi that are hooked up into the root hairs, that can go into like small pores and translocate nutrients back into the plant roots. Particularly good in taking up phosphorus, but I think we're learning that also mycorrhizal fungi are really important with nitrogen and water, and with ectomycorrhizae, the ones that are more associated with trees, can really help the plant with drought and heavy metals. They can be really helpful in mining sites. So those are the benefits to the plants, and the benefits to the fungus is you get your own source of carbon because you're directly hooked into the photosynthate, the sugars that the plant has produced during photosynthesis, and also you may get growth factors. So it's a good deal for both if the relationship stays healthy. So I want to talk about now about another really important concept, and it's got a little chemistry in it, but it's kind of hard to avoid this. But to talk a little bit about this enormous metabolic diversity of microorganisms on the planet. And so we have to talk about getting energy, right? Everybody needs energy. You're going to eat whatever food, and it's going to be oxidized in your body, and you're going to make ATP, and you're going to survive another day. So everybody carries out these oxidation reduction reactions. And here is an oxidation reaction of sugar and oxygen. So just like, you ate your power bar and broke it down into, it was broken down through a series of reactions using oxygen that you're bringing in through respiration and producing CO2 and water as byproducts. So these are two half reactions where you have a donor shown here. Glucose is the donor, and an acceptor, which is oxygen in this case. So this is a very common reaction. A lot of microorganisms carry out this reaction, but humans also carry out this reaction. Now, and so there's the two redox pairs. So we have the donor and what it turns into, and the acceptor and what it turns into. So this is an example of a particular kind of lifestyle. This is aerobic organoheterotroph. And we're going to look a tiny bit at the definitions just to set up this kind of underpinning of this huge diversity that we find in microorganisms. But the cool thing about microorganisms is, unlike us, they actually can use a whole variety of different compounds as donors and a whole variety of different compounds as acceptors. They're not just stuck with organic compounds and oxygen. So let's talk a little bit about this variety of lifestyle of microorganisms. So everyone needs a donor, and so organisms that use organic molecules are organotrophs. But there's bacteria that can use inorganic trophs, lithotrophs. They're rock eaters, and very interesting lifestyle that's really important in agriculture. And then, of course, there's phototrophs. And then electron acceptor. Again, humans, animals, they mainly can just use oxygen. They are aerobes. But there's a lot of bacteria and archaea that can use compounds other than oxygen. And these can be strict anaerobes or facultative anaerobes. So they can make livings in completely different kinds of environments that plants and animals might be shut out from. And then also their carbon as well. So let's just end with this graph showing, this overview, that these, getting across the point that these oxidation reduction reactions are the drivers of biogeochemical cycles. So all these different kinds of reactions that we showed here in this slide of here's a donor and here's an acceptor. But remember, I told you could swap. Microorganisms can swap different compounds in as the donor and as the acceptor, and leads to these different kinds of lifestyles. So Let's just look at the donor. So we know sugars, but also amino acids, fats, petroleum, lignin, pesticides are all compounds that can be used as donors by a variety of different microorganisms. But lithotrophs also, they can use inorganic compounds. They don't need organic compounds only. So ammonium, sulfide, ferrous iron, manganese, mercury, chromium. There's all kinds of inorganic compounds that microorganisms can make a living from. What can be the acceptor? Well, we know oxygen is, but then what about compounds other than oxygen? Well, nitrate, sulfate, selenate, that's a mistake, ferric iron, carbon dioxide. So the using oxygen as electron acceptor, that's aerobic respiration, but there's a lot of organisms that can use other compounds, and that's called anaerobic respiration. The fact that these compounds are all being transformed back and forth into each other under aerobic and anaerobic conditions is essentially what is at the base of biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycles, the nitrogen cycle, the sulfur cycle, the carbon cycle, they aren't just happening disembodied. They're not just chemical processes that happen. They happen because microorganisms are just trying to eke out livings. They're making a living, and they have this huge diversity of ways they can make a living with big consequences on systems. Okay, so to summarize, I hope I gave you an overview of the soil food web, and we talked about this tremendous diversity of microorganisms and this huge number of functions that we know some about, but there's way more that we still can learn about. But I think often in agriculture, we don't think about it from this perspective and maybe lose opportunities that could be taken to promote their activities and get these services from these functions. We talked about the major groups of organisms that are in soil very briefly. Sorry about that. There's many more things that we could say. And then we talked about lifestyles. So there's a huge diversity of ways microorganisms make a living, obtain energy, and that is the driving force behind biogeochemical cycles. And also symbiotic relationships are really important, and they are part of the lives of everybody, including us, in ways that we're only starting to learn about our microbiomes. So going to end there, and the next video is going to be lecture 5, looking at the principles of carbon and nitrogen cycling, and we'll connect to some of these more basic principles that we looked at today. Thank you.